All right. Here we are, all good to go. Should be live. Just gonna give it a second so I can hear myself. I understand that we won't have a ton of people here because it is a Sunday for NFL and stuff. But if you are here, I do appreciate it. Slate goes live in 45 minutes. I'll be here for about give or take. Let me mute that now. Um, so let's go ahead and traverse the slate. Now, one thing that I was thinking of following last week's race and really the last 5 or 6 ish slates, from my own perspective, was that I was not playing them correctly. I was stuck in my old ways of like how F1, DFS was, to where you have all the favorites starting up front and you're having to decipher between the values in the back. And I've been missing a lot on like the mid tier, or at least the mid starting grid positions, whether it be Akon, Franco, Yuki, Gaston, whenever people would start from like 7 to 12 or whatever and make it into the points. I've been having a really, really tough time building lineups like that and entering the show, or this show rather. I was going to be like, okay, this is probably where I need to readjust. It's where I need to get back to um, focusing on at least not building in such an archaic way, or not even archaic, but like in races to where that isn't being, or that isn't leading to being optimal or whatever, right? And it just so happens that this is, a slate that is a very old school slate of where all the guys up front are starting up front, and the reason why this is so important is because really the opposite of what happened last week, of me just kind of being, I don't even think lazy, just hey, not really paying attention, that hey, we have a lot of more expensive guys, starting up front that we probably need to focus on. And Gasly blew a motor, but still people who were starting, 13th and 14th and stuff were needed, especially in the mid range. Whereas today we're back, we're back to the old school types of slates and whatnot. So we have, pretty much all the expensive guys starting inside the top, 8 pretty much. And especially when we look at the top 6 guys, they're all within pretty much the top 7, right? Now the reason why that's important, and especially with how everything is playing out with the constructors and stuff, is this should be a much easier slate to possibly have sims go the correct way, whether it's yours, Saber Sims, whatever you're doing, whether it's doing 1v1s and identifying the constructors, okay? And so when we look at this here, and you look at the fact that Verstappen lost the pole due to just however the officials want to officiate, and then shout out to George for making it seem like a real thing, that he screwed up his Q lap and stuff. But when we look here, it's very unlikely that any of the constructors from eighth down are going to be viable today. It's very much a situation where Perez will most likely not be a factor in the constructor that we're looking for. Okay. Now, McLaren did perform well in the sprint race. So typically, whenever we have sprint races, I typically look at least how people are running in that sprint race to have an idea of what they're going to do. Now, the fact that we normally have the qualifying for the actual F1 race earlier in the week and then the sprint race later, like, whatever. Now, Verstappen and, Perez finished 20th. Verstappen ran pretty poor and got passed early in the F1 or in the sprint race and lost positions. I'm leaning towards the fact that Red Bull just wanted to secure the championship. They understand how Max races, and at this point, I really do think it's very much a situation where, like in Vegas, they're like, "Hey, Max, listen, if you can just bring the car home and win the championship, we'll let you go just ape shit the last couple weeks, right?" So I think Max is in play. Clearly, Russell, Norris, Oscar, Leclerc, Hamilton, and Sainz are in play. And the reason why I'm saying that is we most likely need 2 of them. Okay, when we get a situation like this, the 2 avenues are the race winner, unless he's the most expensive guy, in this case Max, or Lando. The race winner, whether it's George, Oscar, Leclerc, Hamilton, or Sainz as the captain, with Verstappen and Lando being a 1v1 in the flex of what um not what, of just who can finish in front of each other, or who can finish. um, higher between Verstappen and Norris. The reason I'm saying that, and yet again, when we look at these lineups, yet again, this race should be much easier at determining, the builds. And so just right off the bat, we look at, highest projected drivers, and we're seeing that we're going to be using pretty much a lot of the salary. Real chance in this race today, which as we've gone into another F1 season and another situation to, have more data points, I will say that the scoring isn't nearly as busted as I would argue for, the first while. Now that we do have, more parity and stuff, or more, oh, I guess, yeah, parity is the word. I hate that word. Um, the fact that we have more guys competing for the wins and everything makes it much more appealing, outside of situations like this, to where we're noticing that just right off projected score, we're using pretty much all of the salary, right? Just be 1v1s and real situations where we're going to have duplications across the board when we look at projected score. Now, the interesting thing is, and yet again, I don't fully believe that this might be the case. I think there's a real chance that um, Mercedes ends up being the highest constructor here. I think this is kind of an old data point, or I think these should drastically be closer. So yet again, we'll just kind of discount the ownership rate. It's not because of what they did at Vegas this past weekend, but it's when we're looking at this race. If you're leaning off the sprint race, you're expecting McLaren to finish 1-2, or at least have two cars in the podium. If you're looking at the advantage that McLaren now has to fight with Max, and Russell has a chance of at least securing probably second place for majority of this race, um, first or second, I think Max is going to really compete today for the race win. And we see the early, McLaren in third and fourth with Lewis in sixth. I think it should be much more of a coin flip between Mercedes and McLaren today in your constructor. And when we look at projected score, that's when the salary really starts to come into play here, because with McLaren being $1,500 more expensive, that's getting pretty tight here. When we start looking at um, races or lineups that have McLaren, look at the kind of the difference in what we're getting between these drivers. We're probably seeing more um, middle tier plays, and this is just going by projected score at the moment. We're not looking at anything else, but you're looking at the less valued McLaren here with pretty much guys who, I mean, let me look at the grid here. Bottas and Zhao, heads up coin flip. We see Liam being the underdog for the head to head between Yuki and stuff, and so you have to start taking more of the, what I would argue is probably the bad teammates, because they're cheaper and stuff, outside of Kevin Magnussen here. Um, and you see that if we're playing McLaren, we're looking more to punting at the top of the constructor today. Okay. Whereas when we look at the Mercedes um builds, which actually we can just leave those on there because they're the higher ones, we see that this is a case to where we're most likely, actually being able to pay up for a captain. Now, yet again, Albon, Lawson, and Bottas are still the highest exposure here, but I think Russell would probably end up finishing top three. You're probably going to need him, especially now the fact that he starts first. He's not going to kill you um, starting or being falling to second, because that's where he would have originally started, and he would have still been a good play. He can still fall to third and still beat his teammate and still be viable. So there's a real chance that Russell is probably the favorite captain um, today. Now, if we look at a situation where Russell isn't that, and again, this is just projected score, you can see that we're kind of all over the place punting wise and stuff. And if we're not doing that, we're using both Verstappen or Russell and Norris. Really just depend on whoever is scoring um, more here. And if you take Russell out, that's when we start seeing more McLaren constructors. Anyway, and yet again, this show is more so for me to try and determine where or what lineups are going to be played, which ones aren't going to be played that are viable and whatnot. So when we look at win rate here, which I would argue that this is probably a good amount, or a good, just from what SaberSim can normally do when we look at the Sims, especially in such a condensed grid like this to where it's this guy or this guy, this guy or this guy, and we're more factoring in the back of the field. Like these are probably the lineups that we are probably having to fight against for the most part. Um, what I'm gonna personally try and do is probably not get to Botas or Joe, mainly due to the fact that since these are you, I mean, when we're at Botas and Joe, we're seeing that we got slight, um, not slight, but a little bit of salary left over. I would kind of prioritize Franco here. I think there's a real chance he can gain positions and pass a few guys, and probably be head to head with Albon. Um, and again, we see Franco here as well. But we're really doing, your final 3 guys here, of just being 1v1s because I would lean towards Russell being the captain. I think him scoring, nearly what is that gonna be? And I'll look at chat in a second. Um, Probably gonna see Russell probably end up at 26 points or so, realistically, unless he falls to 3rd, then we're looking at, like, 23 or something. I think that is probably what we wanna look at in the captain range here. Now, the interesting thing is that, when we look at win rate just on this, Verstappen is slightly beating, Lando here, and typically, that'd be a much, more important thing, but the fact that I think this is the closest Verstappen and Lando have been priced. So Lando's been 12-6, 12-4, 13-6, 13,000 in the last 5 races, whereas we have Verstappen at 13, 12, 12, 11, 6, 12. The fact that this gap has grown back to pretty much being nothing between these 2 guys, because typically we had a much bigger one, earlier in the season. I am gonna lean Verstappen scores better than Norris in this race, or finishes better, but it's gonna come down to those 2. I would lean towards Russell being the captain. Whoever beats each other between Verstappen or Norris, whether that's finishing second to George, whether that's winning the race, just whoever finishes better between those 2 guys are gonna dictate it. Now, the fact that this is probably only, unless, stuff gets crazy, it's probably gonna be one of each constructor in the podium position. I would lean towards the discount that Mercedes lends us. Now, typically, that would be because, George would be the favorite or to finish first, second here. Because typically you want the winner plus your captain, and then as long as the other teammate isn't incompetent and can finish like 6th or 5th, they can typically outscore. If Lando and Norris, end up finishing 3rd and 4th, uh, 6th and 1st plus laps led, will probably end up outscoring the McLaren guys here. And so I would lean towards Mercedes being the constructor you go to. I would lean towards Russell being um, the captain you use, and I haven't figured out what I personally want to do with the remaining 3 drivers here, because yet again, it's 1v1 between Norris and stuff. Let's go and see what you guys are saying really fast. The slate starts in 32 minutes. I do appreciate you being here on a Sunday. Bobby Fi, Sheets and Brody should be live at the top of the hour, or at least I know Sheets will, to talk the NFL slate. Let's see what's going on here. No, so K, so Max is an absolute giga chad, right? He drives like, a wild man. Not even in a sense of good or bad. You just got to admit, like Max is here to drive. The reason he's, basically always talking back to his team is because he's like, guys, I just want to drive. I'm not going to be here forever. Let's actually win some races here. Um, I would argue, honestly, the championship doesn't even matter to him. Like, we knew he was going to win it straight up, entering this year. We knew the fact that, and really outside of him blowing a motor earlier in the year, it should have been done, way sooner than that. Similar to other seasons, he's wrapped it up early. I would say, if anything, he's more in play now that the championship is finished there, and the fact that there's a real likelihood that Red Bull isn't going to win the constructors championship. And they're just going to try and take as many points away from Mercedes and McLaren. I would play Verstappen today. Cola. Oh, Franco. I was like, yeah. So yet again, going back to like the old school, like year 1 and stuff. That was typically, and the fact that that's also popping up shows the improvements on this stuff, because typically that's what I would end up I would usually end up paying up for, at least, going back in previous ones I've done, I would end up going up for the constructor, or uh, we end up punting at the um, captain, in situations where we aren't paying up and stuff. And so when we look at where these guys are here, we're looking at captains, looking at Franco. I'm assuming it's with the so like how bad are these lines, right? We're looking at 96, 94. So we have Franco assuming that he can pass his teammate, probably get to 15, so he's given 5 points plus probably two for the place differential that he could possibly get. In this situation, that all he has to do is just beat Albon in this situation. So you then get Verstappen, who I would have favorited over Lando. You then have the race winner, Alonso, beating his teammate, so that's good. And then Hulkenberg would be the only downside on like this lineup. So you need, Nico to beat Kevin. But like when you look at a race, when you look at a lineup like this, it's very easy to see beats teammate, beats teammate, beats teammate, beats teammate. So you already have one, two, three, four of your five drivers being your teammate. That's typically, what you want to do. Like by definition, we need pretty much five of those, outside of rare occasions. So you need all your teammates being the other guy, which in this lineup is has a high likelihood and stuff. When you look at the cash rate of this line, like typically I don't really trust, or not trust rather, but I don't really focus on that. But I would argue, and if I could, I mean, I'm not going to play this line because I'm not playing many. Um, but I would put money on this line in that it cashes in the contest today. I would be shocked if this lineup does not cash today. I think Franco makes a really, really good play in the captain position, so that's nothing um, bad, or you shouldn't be shocked with that. In fact, those lineups aren't played nearly as much, and typically, anytime, I guess it's probably 50-50. It's either I end up playing the really chalky, like obvious play, or my punt captain is usually finished as a top three lineup. So typically, and kind of going back to things that I had noticed, recently and stuff, like because I had been so, focused on like races that had been like this, and when I had success, I hadn't been, adjusting correctly to, cheaper guys starting in the front, or closer up in the positions. But in races like this, to where we're looking at the salary or the cheap guys being in the back of the field, all the expensive guys being up front, punting the captain is very, very viable in these races, Daniels. Uh, yeah, and I think there's a really, really good chance of Max Verstappen winning this race, kind of like you noticed. Let me go ahead and just take a look really fast. Now, this is late, we're half an hour before this stupid race, but I want to see what the odds are on Max right now. So Russell's still the favorite. Um, which is very, very interesting. This seems like a race to where if I could bet, I would absolutely put money on Verstappen to possibly win this race today. Um, I do believe that's mainly it. I think we've talked about everything so far. Let me see. It's really not gonna. Is McLaren really not going to get the ownership they should? I mean, I don't. SaberSim has them projected as the highest captains. But when we look at which is what I focus on, right? Like when we look at that compared to, so we're looking at the top 1,000 lines here. That's why I build a pool, not to sim the contest or whatever, but I want all possible lineups that are like could be made, so I don't have to goof around and find stuff. And when we look at the top 1,000, right? Look at the win rate of the contest. We're seeing that it's pretty split between these guys, okay? 30, 34, 33 between these. I think that makes way more sense. When we look at the projected score between these guys, we see that these lineups are pretty much, 50-50 in the pool. And then, actually, I'm looking at the wrong one. The exposure rate between the top 1,000 leans Mercedes, when we look at projected score, when we look at the win rate between these two, um, The win rate leans more towards McLaren. Let me make sure I don't get anybody. Well, it's because I have Russell off. Um, Win rate here is pretty, I would argue pretty 50-50, like 40-30 split in a in a contest like this is pretty significant. And then when we look at predicted score again, it flips. Like I would lean to these. I would lean to McLaren being less as a constructor being less owned than Mercedes, and because of that, Oscar is pretty much not going to be owned at all. And Norris would probably like you're probably not being able to afford him in the captain, so we're probably looking at Lando being like 30. I would say he's like 30% owned, give or take. I mean, Saberson's got him at 20 in the driver. I'd lean him closer to 30 because we're not really playing him in the captain at all. Maybe closer to 25. But I would lean and see. I mean, it doesn't matter. I'm not going to argue. And I mean, I always just look at DraftKings Sportsbook just because that's easier for me to access and stuff. Because Max is the second favorite. I would lean towards Max being much more in play than what people are giving credit for. I think they are leaning more on the sprint race. I think there's a real chance that Max, competes today, and the fact that they did the sprint race before, or they qualified in the weekend and then qualified for the sprint race. I mean, they just took Checo out of the sprint, and there's no reason on running him harder or whatever, right? And Max and Red Bull saw what they need to work on. Typically, when you give them a team that information in race conditions, they're going to make adjustments that are head and shoulders above what they had before, and so that's why I like Max so much as a driver today. And I think there's a real chance he wins this race. So in F1, I mean, plus 225 and stuff, or plus 275 isn't like a great thing. The fact that you can probably get the potential race winner as the third favorite today, I think that's pretty significant. I do believe that's it. I haven't figured out what lines I'm going to do. I don't think I'm going to do, like I said, I don't think I'm going to do any with the Sabre guys. I think Franco is a fantastic play today. Let me see what Alonso has been doing recently. 11th, 14th, 8th. I'd be real concerned about Alonso falling through the field. But I think that's about it. I think ownership leans Mercedes much more than what things are probably indicating. In the contest of us trying to figure out where people are going to go or what's going to happen and whatnot. I think there's going to be a ton of trains today. You better be expecting people to run their 15, 20, 15, 10 best lineups 3 to 4 times. It really does seem like a slate like that is that's the way to go. And outside of people crashing, when we get like really really different, right? Like we're just like a projected score really fast. Between the number 1 rated lineup, and let's just go to we're at 1038. We look at 700 and we're at 94. I mean, I think if you're entering this slate with lines that are I mean, yeah, sure, this is unique, but I just don't see these lineups even competing to win today at all. And so keep that in mind. If you're looking at lineups that are by default projected for 13, 15 points less right off the bat, I think those are pretty much dead lineups. This is not a contest to where I would be throwing out total unique lineups at all. I think that'd be pretty futile and not a good return on really anything. But I do believe that's it. Thank you guys for hanging out. Hope you enjoy the NFL show at the top of the hour, and hopefully the F1 race goes in your favor. And I'll see you guys next time. So peace out. Thank you for being here.